This video is brought to you by Brilliant. The European economy clearly isn't having a great time at the moment. While we're seeing some signs of recovery, growth has been pretty weak since at least the pandemic, and Europe looks dangerously vulnerable to Trump's ever-escalating trade wars. Nonetheless, quite a lot of this is sort of self-inflicted, or at least fixable. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at a couple of ways the EU could fix its flailing economy. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. So let's get straight into it. The first and perhaps most important thing that the EU can do to improve its economic prospects is to remove internal trade barriers within the single market. The European single market is nominally built on the principles of the 4 freedoms: free movement of goods, services, people, and capital. When it was originally conceived, the basic idea behind it was that one big open market would be better than lots of smaller markets within national economies. A single market would be better for consumers because there would be more competition and more choice, but also better for businesses because it would be easier to do intracontinental trade and there would be a bigger consumer market to sell to. Harmonised regulations were also supposed to reduce bureaucracy, making it easier for businesses and national governments alike. At the time, European policymakers would look enviously across the pond to the United States, where the enormous size of the unified American market has clearly aided America's economic growth. And yet, so far, the single market has failed to live up to its lofty aspirations, and progress has actually reversed in certain respects. Most obviously, as anxieties about immigration have grown, more and more EU countries have started imposing restrictions on cross-border travel. These restrictions are supposed to be a temporary last resort measure reserved for exceptional situations, but quite a few EU countries have now essentially imposed them permanently and just renew them periodically. But on top of these restrictions, there are other more subtle places where the single market is falling short. In part because national governments don't like giving up power to Brussels, and national regulations aren't well harmonised, which makes doing business in another European country surprisingly difficult. This is true for manufacturers. It's harder than it should be to, say, sell French wine in Lithuania, but it's especially true for services. It's even harder, for instance, to be a German lawyer in Slovenia. According to a 2020 study by the IMF, Europe's internal barriers are equivalent to a tariff of 45% for manufacturing and 110% for services. This is far higher than the equivalent internal barriers between American states, and explains why trade across EU countries is less than half the level of trade across US states. Paradoxically, these internal trade barriers partly explain why the EU now does so much trade with the rest of the world. When it's hard to trade with your neighbours, you're going to start looking elsewhere, especially when, thanks to EU-level free trade deals, international trade is becoming easier. This is why, in the Eurozone, trade as a percentage of GDP has risen from 31% in 1999 to 55% today. Again, far higher than in the US, where trade accounts for just 25% of GDP. Anyway, on to the second thing on our list, a capital markets union. This might sound technical or maybe even boring, but the basic idea here is both pretty simple and pretty important. In simple terms, this is a plan to create a more connected and open financial market across the EU, so that companies in one EU country can easily raise money from investors in other EU countries. At the moment, raising big sums of money in the EU is really quite difficult, because European companies are sort of restricted to their national market, which both makes it harder for new companies to find financing and for more established companies to increase investment. This is perhaps the main reason that Europe doesn't really have any big tech companies, or at least none of equivalent size to those that you find in the US. And this is actually one of the big reasons that America's headline productivity is a fair bit higher than Europe's. While European productivity growth has broadly tracked that of the US in most sectors, US tech companies have seen far steeper productivity growth in the past couple of decades than their European counterparts. Europe's tech sector has also been hamstrung by regulation. GDPR, for instance, is estimated to have reduced profits for small European tech firms by up to 12%, according to a 2022 CEPR analysis. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that tech regulation is necessarily a bad thing, and the hyper laissez-faire attitude adopted by the US clearly has some downsides. But it's nonetheless true to say that certain regulations have incurred a competitive disadvantage on European tech firms. The third thing that Europe needs to do is increase domestic demand. For context, GDP is often defined as the sum of four things: investment, government spending, net exports, and domestic demand, which basically refers to how much households and individuals spend consuming stuff. In the EU, domestic demand has been weak since basically the 2008 financial crisis. But this problem became particularly acute after the pandemic, and Eurozone consumption is still below the pre-pandemic trend, at least by some measures. This has made the EU more dependent on exports, and it's the main reason that, after 2008, the EU started running consistent trade surpluses, i.e. exporting more than it imported. This is essentially because if Europeans aren't spending or buying enough, then European products have to be sold elsewhere, which pushes up exports. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, if you can find markets for your exports, then it doesn't really matter who's buying them. But it has made the EU economy uniquely vulnerable to a global economic slowdown or disruptions to international trade, like we're seeing at the moment. This is why, for instance, Trump actually does have a fair bit of leverage on the EU. The EU relies on American consumers to buy its products. So if Trump imposes tariffs that reduces sales, European manufacturers are going to be left with an excess of products. That is, assuming we don't see a sudden increase in domestic demand. Similarly, the decline in consumer confidence we've seen in China since the housing slowdown a couple of years ago has also been bad news for the European economy, because European manufacturers used to sell quite a lot of their surplus to China. Anyway, the point we're making is that at the moment, the looming Trump-related disruptions to global trade don't look good for Europe, but at least some of this pain can be offset if the EU can find ways to stimulate domestic demand. The difficulty here is that recent history suggests the best way to do this is for governments to essentially give money to households somehow. But most national governments in Europe, apart from Germany, lack the fiscal space for a large stimulus package. So it's not obvious how they'd achieve this. At TLDR News, we're always trying to help you learn more about the world around you. Luckily for us, our sponsor this week, Brilliant, shares this same commitment, with thousands of lessons in maths, science, programming, and AI. And not only that, their interactive lessons teach you by doing, instead of just asking you to mindlessly memorize stuff. This helps you build your critical thinking skills and become a better thinker. For instance, Brilliant's newly updated maths courses help you establish a strong foundation in algebra. It then helps you build on this, teaching you how to conquer calculus, all while maintaining an emphasis on problem solving and reasoning. The thing I like best about this, though, is that their mathematical courses help you develop your mathematical intuition and fluency, skills that you can use in the real world. As we've told you before, data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try Brilliant for free, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.